Oh, my ear is so red from these ear cuffs. They're so cute, but they're so painful. Ouch. Oh, just don't touch this one and we'll be fine. Yeah? Yeah. Hello there and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another project. And I'm really very excited to show you this project today because I'm thrilled with how this came out. As you know, I have a lot of dresses with large sleeves, dresses and blouses. Honestly, a lot of stuff with large sleeves that aren't exactly going to fit into a regular coat sleeve. So I decided I need some sort of a topper to wear over my more epic sleeved garments. And of course, a cloak or a cape is always a good option, but I decided to try and find some sort of in-between between a coat and a cape. And really, I just long admired this coat that Dita Von Teese is often seen wearing at the airport. And I feel bad that these are all paparazzi shots of her and they've been invading her privacy, but it was really helpful to see the construction details of this coat. And this cape coat is from Alexander McQueen. I was able to find some sort of online listing images of another coat like this as well. And really the style is actually from the 1930s because I found a lot of vintage images and different versions of this from the 30s and all the way actually into the late 60s and in the 70s when they were kind of redoing 1930s styles anyhow. So the various revivals of the cape coat mean they've kind of been sprinkled through time since the 20th century. And I did spend quite a lot of time analyzing just what was going on with that Alexander McQueen cape, so let's go ahead and jump in and look at the details. Alright, I've turned the exposure up on these images so we can see what's going on a little bit more here. This is kind of almost a coat dress. It seems to be made out of a thicker wool. You can see here that if you're looking closely, that the cape portion, the sleeves as it were, are not actually lined. They are just turned up at the bottom and hemmed, and they're actually not too flared. We can see while looking at the back here on the right that it's not a full circle cut. It is, quite close to the arm. It's only maybe an A-line shape here, so it's not too flared, and so I'll play with that later. But the main body of this is almost like a sleeveless dress or a long vest, really. It is lined compared to the outside capey sleeves, which are not lined, and there is a gap in the back of this where these sleeves attach at the waist, where that little velvet band is. There is a gap in the sleeves there because you can slip a belt in here and cinch this down because Dita wears hers like that all the time. And the front of this is fitted with double-ended darts and is actually a rather straight cut on the skirt. It's almost a narrowed pencil skirt, at least in this image it looks like that. It's probably just a straight cut skirt. The back, of course, has all this pleating done at the center back for a little bit of extra room and floof. And we can see on the back here there's a center back seam, a stand collar that doesn't go all the way to close at the very, very front. You can see that that stand collar leaves about a 4-inch gap in the front. I didn't leave a ton of gap in mine. I probably should have widened this a little bit further like this McQueen example because the collar, when it rubs up against your chin, will of course get makeup on it, which is a problem. But in the back, in addition to that center back seam, we also have the back princess seams. So there are princess seams on the back of this and double-ended darts on the front, but I won't be copying these style lines exactly for my version today. A few other things we can note from looking at the images of this coat being worn. If you look very closely down here, you can see that the back of this sleevey cape portion on each side is hemmed separately, of course, entirely from the actual body, like the coat body itself, and that it's almost looks like it's tacked right here so that it's hemmed. The hem is just turned up. There's a seam binding on all the edges of these sleeves. They do seem to be just a thick, like felted wool. And then they just have a seam binding finishing the edges of this, the raw edges. And that hem is turned up about 1.5 inches maybe. And then it seems to be tacked right here so that this stays folded in the back. And again, up here at the shoulder, you can kind of see how this is self-faced. It's like folded back on itself so that these hang nicely when the wind isn't blowing this violently. This also does have a hidden button closure along the front. There's like a hidden button placket like I did for the silk blouse that you saw on the channel recently. And in these images here, you can see that those buttons don't run all the way along the front length of the coat, just about halfway down past the waist. And then you can see the white lining of this coat, which is nice to have it fully lined, but I do question the choice of like a semi-transparent white lining on this lovely black coat. A red, a lime green, even like a silvery gray would be a little bit better, I think, than this stark white. And here I am at the patterning surface with a blank sheet of alphanumeric and my bodice block front, of course. I'm going to start drawing some guidelines for myself, and I was thinking, how much overlap do I want at the front of this? 1 inch? No, I'm going to want more than that, so let me add a little bit more on here. You can see my sketch. This is very similar to the Alexander McQueen coat, just with a couple of more TCH-approved modifications, including instead of having the double-ended darts on the front, I'm going to go ahead and do a princess seam from the waist up, and I'm going to do that princess seam that goes up into the neckline. I think it will give a little bit more of a space-age look to this in the end. Probably makes it look a little bit more 60s than 30s, but in the end, I think this has much more of a like kind of Star Wars vibe than anything else. But the first modification I'm going to make here is to add a 1/2 inch along the side seam. Plenty of extra room in this because I want to be able to wear stuff underneath this. This is not just a dress. This is a overgarment that I'm going to be wearing over other things. So I want to add in a full 1/2 inch along the side seam. I'm actually going to lower the arm side a full inch as well, just to give plenty of room there for sticking sleeves through this garment, because the whole idea of making a coat like this is to be able to wear it over my large sleeved garments. And right now I have a full 2 inches along the center front of this. That does get adjusted a little bit more further on. Of course, I want to make this again into that princess seam, so I'll draw a line from my apex up into the neckline here, about 1 inch out from the center front. And I can draw some notches along that, just 2 inches out from the apex, so that once I close this dart and eliminate the dart fullness into a style line, I can still line this up later and have my notches so I know where everything needs to go along the bust. Well, let's go ahead and cut this out. And I did also tip the shoulder up 1/8 of an inch and out 1/4 of an inch, just to give a slightly stronger shoulder. And though I won't be putting a shoulder pad into this garment itself, I did want a tiny bit of extra room at the shoulder because I might wear this over things that do have shoulder padding in them. So some of my dresses, like that big black and silver dress I made recently, there is built-in shoulder padding in that dress itself. And so I wanted to leave a little bit of room in this coat for wearing it over things that have large shoulders. But I will, of course, cut up my waist dart to the apex and out along my new style line like so, and I can cut my dart away. Goodbye. Don't need that anymore. Now all this fit will be encompassed within this style line instead of actually having to sew my darts. I'll close this side dart as well, tape that shut, tape down my floops, and of course I will need to add seam allowance along this new style line. Like so, like magic. Now I'll cut the front down to have 2 inches past the center front. I was thinking the finished garment would extend 1 inch past the center front, but then I decided if that was the case, I wanted more than 1 inch of overlap. So I went ahead and made sure that this had 1 3/4 of an inch overlap here, or underlap as it were, because this will flap to the inside later. You'll see how I end up finishing this. I am going to interline this coat with cotton muslin today, just for a little bit of extra stability, structure, and even warmth, I suppose. An extra layer of cotton muslin is still something. But if you wanted to make something like this where you're actually adding quite a lot of warmth, you could either do cotton flannel or a wool flannel within the body of the coat as interlining. It'll add quite a lot of bulk, of course, but it'll also add quite a lot of warmth. So yes, along the front, total from the center front, there is 1 inch of overlap and then an additional 1 3/4 inch sort of under facing. And I'll trace a copy of my back here, drawing the dart as usual, even though I'll be moving things around. Just create a tracing, and I need to make the same modifications to the shoulder and arm side that I did on the front. And I will, of course, make the back princess seamed as well. I'm going to have this come up pretty high up into the arm side, like so. I will add a 1/2 inch along the center back, so I can have a center back seam back here. And I need to, again, yes, lower this that 1 inch and bring the side seam out that same 1/2 inch that I did on the front. Again, bring that shoulder up 1/8 of an inch and out 1/4 of an inch, like so. Draw in a new arm side and cut this out. I think if anything, I would actually have lowered the arm side a little bit more, just to give myself even more room down there. This is fine. It's not a problem, but I think even a little bit more room for sticking different sleeves in here would have been good. I am going to actually widen the neckline a little bit as well, again, just so that it will fit over things. So if I'm wearing something that has a stand collar or raised collar underneath, I want there to be room in the coat to kind of slide and fit over that. So I'm going to widen the neckline about 1/4 of an inch along the shoulder seam here and lower it actually in the front that full 1/4 inch from shoulder to front neckline. I can go ahead and actually move my dart closer to the center back by 5/8 of an inch. Just tilt that before I cut these apart, cut away that dart fullness, and then add seam allowance along the back style line here as well. And I am sorry if today you can hear any rattling in the background. I actually tore into my PC today to figure out which of the many fans in there was causing a problem, and it is within the power supply. So I'm going to have to replace that. It could be a few days. So right now I'm actually recording this while my PC is wrapped in an old comforter to hopefully dampen the rattling. So I'm doing my best here, guys. Doing my best. So there is the bodice pattern all together. Let me grab some more paper to use. I will start with my pencil skirt patterns here, and I'll start with the front. I'm going to do that narrow A-line, so like the half flared A-line skirt for the front here. Again, I'm going to create the same extension from the center front here. So 1 inch of overlap and then 1 3/4, like so, of like all in one facing, basically, along the center front of this. Like so. Mark my center front on here so I don't get lost. And I will be doing that pivot method to close one of my darts here. And I want to keep this first dart because it will line up with the princess seam on the bodice, and then close this second dart and trace in the rest of the skirt. So I have a slightly flared A-line in the front here. Again, the Alexander McQueen cape coat that I was inspired by does seem to have more of a straight skirt in the front, but I can make it slightly A-lined if I want to. I'm in full control of this coat's destiny. And I did add that same 1/2 inch along the side seam as well that I did for the bodice, so this will still match up with the bodice along the side seam. Cape Coat 24 skirt front. The other thing I'm going to do here is add on a full 2 inches to the hem, because I'd rather this finish quite like of a midi length, a T length as it were, something quite long so that it's always longer than my dresses underneath. And I do make my dresses around 30 to even 31 inches long, so I want to make sure this is a little bit longer than that so that it will always cover my hem. Then for the back, I again will add a center back seam. This only needs to have 1/2 inch of seam allowance here. And I will trace up to my first dart, and I will actually close both darts here in the back so that I have a full A-line skirt back. So it's a slightly more flared skirt here in the back than it was in the front. Again, adding that 1/2 inch along the side seam as well, just like I did for the front and for the bodice. And then adding that 2 inches to the hem again as well. So cape coat back with all of its little modifications. And I will go ahead and start constructing the cape portion, the sleeves, as it were, the sleevey cape bit. I'm going to square off a line and trace the cap off of my sleeve, just as some starting point to work with. So I know where my shoulder seam needs to match up, and I can start basically turning this into a large A-line flared shape. I'm going to go ahead and test this in muslin by pinning a mock-up of this piece onto a sleeveless dress to see what it looks like and see what I need to change about it. So this is kind of half pattern drafting, half draping today. I'm going to guess my best here on the paper, cut out a version in muslin, and see what I want to change. So I've come out about 5 inches from the center here along the front and squared off a line. I think I'll flare a little bit from there, just because this is, again, supposed to be a bit more of an A-line shape. So from about 10 inches down, it's about 2.5 inches away. Just I don't have my protractor out, so I'm not sure exactly what this angle is, but that gives you some idea. And then because this needs to fold back on itself and kind of self-face itself, I'll add an extra 1.5 inches here for a self-facing along the front. Again, I want to come out at least 4 or 5 inches along the back here. And I actually did get the protractor out this time to try and copy the angle from the front. It's about 45 degrees, just to go ahead and add that in here. And then I was thinking, oh, but we still need seam allowance as well, so I'll add seam allowance to that and kind of curve it up to the top. This really is just a large triangle with the top rounded, but I felt like starting from my sleeve pattern was a good base to kind of begin from. But I will start cutting this out, and I'm actually going to add a wedge of fullness here along the very center, just to add further flare right along the center where this will hang like along the side of my body. So I can just cut that out, and again add in a good, I don't know, up here it's only a couple of inches, but it flares quite a bit at the end. So I'd say this is probably a good maybe 25-30 degree wedge that I'm adding in here. I really need to break that protractor out more often because I can get quite precise instead of just saying I eyeballed it, which I did. But if you want to know exactly what I did, sometimes it might be useful for me to actually measure it, weirdly enough. Or is that too much geometry? Let me know. Should I break out the protractor more and more often? All right, let's cut off that rest of that seam allowance up here. And this will be the first version of my little cape sleeve thingamajig. This will get folded back. The rest of that will get sewn down along the princess seam in the back. I did not sew it into the princess seam in the back. I'm going to finish the dress slash vest slash undercoat bit of this all by itself, and then I'm going to stitch these big cape sleeves on once the rest of this is pretty much done. So you'll see that later. And I held this up to my body and thought, you know what, I think I need a little bit more flare. So I added on another large wedge of fullness in the back as well before I cut this out of muslin to go ahead and start trying to see what it would look like in fabric draped on a dress. So I have the seam allowance pressed into place and that little front facing pressed into place. I've marked this at the center where it needs to line up with the shoulder seam, like so. I'm going to go ahead and just pin that on this sleeveless dress that I have laying around. So just pin this weird cape sleeve extension thingy onto my tie-dye dress here so I can try the dress on and get an idea of how this is going to fall. I will pin this along the dart along the back. I don't have a princess seam on this particular dress to follow, but I can kind of reference my pattern for this cape coat and see if I'm in a similar spot. Basically, if I follow this dart, should be pretty good. Estimator of what is going to happen here when I stitch this down to the cape coat itself later. I will be fully lining my capey sleeves for this, unlike the Alexander McQueen coat, because I'm going to be using a, that's right, say it with me, sparkly black brocade to make my entire coat today, as opposed to a nice felted wool. So you know, I needed to line it because of reasons. So I tried that on and I realized I needed to fold that back section of flare over so that it rolled in on itself just like the McQueen coat does. So that's what I've done here. Basically, all that flare that I added on, like as my last step of the pattern this last time, is folded towards the inside here, and the folded edge is pinned down to the garment itself. And it ended up being a little bit too much flare, so here I am cutting some of that off of the back here. And I will go ahead and actually add it into the middle. I wanted more flare in the middle and less flare folded under along the center back. So I'm just going to take that and add a good, I don't know, 5 inches of flare in here along the center of this again, widening this along the shoulder line, or like the very center side seam of the garment, as opposed to along the princess line of the back. And once again, I will tape down my floops. And I did just make this extremely long. I guessed kind of like from my shoulder to my elbow is around, you know, let's say 12 inches, and then I just added on the skirt length from there. I wanted this to be the same length as the coat dress underneath. And I pinned a new version of this in muslin again onto my dress, so I can show you what this looks like. This is what I was looking at and making modifications to. So this is, you know, my first sleeve version with the flare slightly modified, pinned onto the dress to see what it would look like, kind of get an idea of how things were going. Of course, I had forgotten to add an extra bit of seam allowance so that this could overlap along the top once it's lined. So I do need to do that, and I left a gap at the waist just to see how this needs to be sewn down to the back. Now for the last modifications before I actually cut this out of my real fabric today, I was going to go ahead and extend this shoulder up a little bit further, another 1/4 inch, just to make sure there's enough flare in this buddy. So it's almost a full 1/2 inch of extra room here along the shoulder line for when I'm wearing shoulder padded or puffed sleeves underneath this and need that little bit of extra room. Of course, it'll just be kind of extra room when I'm not wearing something with shoulder pads, but that's all right. And the other thing I wanted to do here is, again, yes, make sure this sleeve was long enough. I would rather cut this out, you know, 3 inches too long and have to cut off extra excess once I let these hang and the bias stretch out of them later. I'd rather have these be cut too long and waste a little bit of this fabric than have them be too short. And I do still need to draft my stand collar, so let's go ahead and do that real fast. I'll square off a line here. This will be the center back. I need to measure my back neckline like so. It's usually around 3 inches. 3 1/4 this time. Sure. And then the front. I want this to end along the princess line in the front, which is a little bit too close in the front if you wear heavy foundation like I do, but that's all right. Luckily this garment today will be mostly polyester, so I can probably scrub that off. Ah, the hazards of glamour. I'm going to mark in the full front neckline, which for me is 4.5 inches, and then I'll mark along that where I want the collar actually to end, because I want a little bit before the exact center front. So I have the center front marked in here. I'm going to mark up a 1/2 inch from that, square off a line, just like I would with my normal stand collar. And I'm just going to make this a little bit shorter in the end, so you'll see that. But I want to make sure I have this angle correct before I shorten this. So tilt up that 1/2 inch, draw that in with my French curve, tilt everything up, and then I'm just going to make it shorter here. So it's about 1 inch shorter than my stand collars normally would be around the neckline. But I'll just add my seam allowance in here, like so, and we have a stand collar pattern. Alright, so I just need to cut everything out of my shimmering black brocade here, and then of course out of muslin as well, because I will be interlining everything. And I'm going to construct most of the main body of the dress, of the coat dress, the under vest as it were, of this before I do the sleeves, because the sleeves are going to be monstrously large and going to need to be hung to stretch that bias, because I cut the front of the sleeve capey bits along straight grain, but the back really interacted with bias quite a lot because it was quite flared, so there was a lot of stretching going on. But once I had everything cut out, I could go ahead and layer my muslin on the back of my brocade pieces. I'm going to lightly pin these into place and then run everything through the serger, both to make sure that these brocade pieces don't fray on me while I'm working on the coat, and also just as a way of basting these together. You could of course hand baste something like this. If you were using a fine suiting wool or a silk and interlining that, then I would recommend hand basting. But because I wanted to kind of fray check the edges of my brocade, my lurex brocade anyhow, I just ran everything through the baby lock over here. And I do still have one dart to sew for this garment, or one on either side of both the interlining and the brocade. So just marking that on my skirt front here for the muslin and for the brocade. Most of the time when I have darts and I'm interlining something, I will interline it first and then sew the darts afterwards. This time I decided to sew the darts first just because I felt the brocade is a far looser weave than the muslin, and I was just worried about how that was going to stretch over time, and I thought it would actually wear better over time by having these darts sewn separately in each layer before I serged the interlining to the outer fabric. I can link the Etsy seller where I picked up this brocade last year below. I was originally going to use it to make a reversible brocade full-length evening robe gown coat thing for Arcana. So I have 5 yards of this here to work with, which I didn't use all of it for this cape coat. And then I used the leftovers to make a separate garment that you will see next month. But yes, I can link the Etsy shop below. They have really nice fabrics, but I ordered more of this exact fabric and they sent me a different brocade, which is what I made that puffy sleeved bodice on the channel out of recently. So it was not the exact same black brocade. It was a nice black brocade, just not the same exact one, which was a bit of a bummer at the time, but obviously we've worked around it. And because I really like both garments that I made in the end instead of making that giant robe, I'm pleased about how things have worked out. The only other thing about that Etsy shop that is not my favorite is that they have actually rather expensive shipping, so it's really best to only order from there if you're going to be getting a lot. And I'm going to go ahead and sew my center backs. And you can see in the end I did cut out the back skirts with 1-inch seam allowance along the back, even though I don't have to put a zipper in this or anything. But I figured I would leave a slit here at the bottom of the skirt just for a little bit of extra movement in this coat. Wearing this as outerwear, I figured I might need a back slit here, so I wanted a full inch of seam allowance along that back slit. So you can see as I'm pressing this center back seam open that I sewed first here along the skirt that I do have that 1 inch back there. And I will go ahead and sew the side seams of the skirt portion of this next. And then I can start assembling the bodice of my undercoat, as it were. I will go ahead and use pins and reference my pattern here to mark where my notches are around the bust, along my style lines, along this front princess seam. I can then go ahead and start to pin those together, line things up. Again, I like to pin anchor points first, so I'll pin the notches together, pin the very top together, and then pin in between, and the same for underneath the bust. So pin that notch and then pin in between along the bust, pin the waist and pin in between. Just keeps me focused and making sure that everything's lining up the way it needs to. And I will also be fully lining the interior coat dress portion of this. And I'll be assembling that and aligning this in the same way that I do a vest, which is why I keep calling it a vest, because for me the assembly of this was like making a vest just with a long skirt attached. But over here on the machine I'm using my 12 stitches per inch, a fresh Microtex needle, because of course I'm sewing with a Lurex brocade. I need the sharpest needle I've got around, and I'll go ahead and sew everything I just prepped with my Gutermann all-purpose thread as per usual. And I'll press open my center back here, center of the back bodice. This doesn't need to have a center back seam. It was just kind of here to line up because the skirt was going to have one and because the McQueen dress had one. Having this stitching line and a little bit of extra thickness from the seam allowance being in here actually adds a little bit of stability and structure to this. Just like a tiny bit of, instead of like putting boning along the center back, this has a little bit of extra fabric and a little bit of stitching along the center back. So it's obviously not doing anything near like having wriggling or steel boning in the back of this wood, but it is still helping with a little bit of extra smoothing, I suppose, along the center back, in my opinion at least. And with my center back seams together, I will go ahead and sew the back princess seams as well, between the backs and the side backs, pinning those into place. And I'll stitch those, of course, over here on the machine. And because these are quite curved, I will go ahead and put some clips in the seam allowance of these back princess seams here before I try to press them nice and open and flat. Giving this a little bit of steam, melting this polyester brocade into place. You know, the muslin presses better than the brocade does. And And I will actually trim out triangles on the side seam side of this, if that makes sense, the side back side of this, so that everything lies extra smooth. And I do need to clip the curves over the bust along the front pieces as well, and again use my tailor's ham to help me press those open nice and flat and smooth along the front princess seam as well. Yet again, I think this fabric looks a little bit like wet pavement in the best possible way, like sparkly, fresh asphalt. You know how I like to look like the back alleyway of a cyberpunk neon city. It's kind of the constant goal at this point, is looking like I own a fancy casino on a space station outside of Mars. You know, it's a 40s noir in space goal. And while at this point I would normally sew my side seams and my shoulder seams, I'm just going to be sewing my shoulder seams of the front and backs together here. For the bodice, because I'm going to be doing the lining in that vest manner, I'm going to leave my shoulder seams open for now and just finish up these side seams. And once those are sewn, of course, I can press them open. Try and remember to use my clapper whenever possible. Kind of hold that into place until everything cools back down to room temperature. Room temperature. Silly me. And now that all of this is sewn together along the waistline, I can sew my skirt onto the rest of this. So just make sure those are nice and pressed into place, and then I can line up the center back of my skirt on top of this, like so. Line up the side seams next, again, pinning anchor points and then pinning the in-between in case anything has stretched out of shape. I want to be able to kind of zhuzh and convince everything back to where it needs to be from the pattern drafting. Again, I'll pin the fronts of this and then pin in between, like so, making sure my princess seam line on the bodice is matching up with the dart on the skirt, so that I have a nice continuous line across the waist along the front of this coat. This project did take me a little bit of extra time compared to what I usually intend. Usually I give myself 2 or 3 days for a project. This ended up taking a little bit extra time just because by the time I got the sleeves kind of onto this later, I wanted to leave it to hang, the hem to hang, and then it was Super Bowl weekend, and so I couldn't work that next day because it was Super Bowl Sunday anyway, and I can't work in my office when there's NFL in the other room just because it's very loud and distracting. So I ended up leaving this over the weekend to let the hem on the dress itself and the sleeves later stretch fully, and then I tried this on and had my mom pin my hem for me so that I could straighten my hems later, which is very useful, of course, to have an assistant in that way. What I will do when I no longer live with her, I'm not quite sure, but that will be an inconvenience. But I will go ahead and press my waist seam open, clip that where it is particularly curved and didn't want to behave, and then I have to go ahead and assemble my lining in the exact same way. So I'll be lining this with a black polyester lining that I actually picked up here in town because I didn't have anything in stock that was wide enough to cut everything out for this because the sleeves are so gigantic. So I ran down to Allen's here in Denver and grabbed some black polyester lining. And I'm actually going to go ahead and pin right sides together and just sew the bottom half of the arm side first. This is going to be a bit of a weird order of operations for lining this coat, so bear with me. I'm lining up right sides together, the fully assembled lining, well, the mostly assembled lining and the mostly assembled coat here. I'm going to pin along the underarm seams, along the arm sides, just leaving the top few inches along the shoulder seams free. And you'll see why in a moment. But I'll just stitch that with 1/2 inch seam allowance, of course. And this is going to be quite a curvy seam, so I will put clips in here before I turn this right side out later. Oof, this rattling of my computer is driving me bonkers. I'm ready to throw money at the problem. Where do I get a new power supply? Unfortunately, it's a Dell PC, and it's actually got a proprietary, fancy little, small, compact power supply in it, so I have to wait. It's a special order problem. Dang it. But yes, I will clip those curves, turn everything to the right side, and press this into place. Along the arm side area, make sure that's all nice and smooth, so that later I can wear whatever sleeve I need to underneath this. This is really where it starts to feel like a giant vest. Of course, this would be the biggest vest I've ever made if that's the case. And now I can go ahead and sew my shoulder seam. So I'll line up the right sides of the brocade layer like so. And because everything is still kind of open up here, I can then sew the lining after this. And then there'll be a little bit of an opening along the outer armscye edge that I can hand stitch closed. Again, just like how I make vests, if you want to see this in a little bit more detail or less of a large garment, check out this vest video here on the channel. Go ahead and press the brocade layer open here along the shoulder seam, and then I can line up, again, right sides together of the lining in that same-ish way. And press those open as well. Everything is nice and pressed and smooth. And then I just need to press the end of the shoulder seam along the armscye under that 1/2 inch that the rest of it is sewn in place already, and fold those together, pin into place, and then I'll just slip stitch this area closed by hand. Which in the end will be completely unseen because it's going to be covered by the giant cape sleeves eventually. But I will attach those separately at the very end. Stitch those closed, and then I can start working on my stand collar here. I will go ahead and interface both my lining and the collar itself, the outside brocade fabric, just because I'm not interlining this area and I want a little bit of extra stiffness up here, so my collar stands to attention, gives me that evil villain vibe that we all know I quite like, especially in my outerwear. Pin those right sides together, all along the outside edge. And I will clip my curves along the ends of this and then flip it right side out, press into place. Again, you could do a little bit of understitching or top stitching on this if you're worried about it behaving itself, but seeing as both sides are interfaced here, I'm not too worried about it moving around on me. And I need to go ahead and attach this on. So I have the center back of this marked on the collar, and I will go ahead and stitch that just to the brocade and interlined layer. So the lining at the neckline is still free, even though it's attached along the arm size. Seems weird, I know, but you'll see why in a moment. But I'll just pin this collar along the neckline of the brocade bit of my garment here, and then I can stitch that on. So it's pinned so that the collar, front bits of the collar line up again with that front princess seam. Just for, you know, design consistency, as it were. I did have a question this week over on the channel, trying to answer my comments and catch up and not get too far behind. But I had a question about, you know, why, in their opinion, my garments looked a little bit more store-bought as opposed to home sewn, and like what the distinction was and what I do differently. To which, of course, the answer is I don't really know why people would perceive things that way. I hope that's the case, that my things look professionally finished, but you know, I don't think that I sew better than anyone else, really. I consider myself kind of a lazy seamstress, as we know, on the whole. So I think part of that, though, might be just because having studied art and design as a part of my university curriculum, I think there are certain times where I pay attention to maybe balance or proportion or like certain aspects of my personal style of designing that come from having studied art in some ways, and that balance and seeing areas where things can line up, or if they aren't going to line up, have it be an intentional choice, are part of the reason why perhaps my things look a little bit more store-bought in the end. I'm not sure how much of that comes into it. It feels a little bit like tooting my own horn to say that, but I did have to pay for that training, so hopefully some of it did rub off onto me, and there is a bit more of a trained eye going into the things I make. But, you know, it seems very frou-frou of me to say so. I've clipped my curves. I'm pressing the seam allowance down into the rest of the coat here. I'm going to press the seam allowance, just with my fingers here, of the lining in on itself, and I will just close up the neckline here, pinning my lining down over the seam allowance along the collar seam here at the neckline. And I will again slip stitch this shut into place so this is all cleanly finished along the inside, along the neck. I will just end this at the collar, by the way, because I'm going to finish the very fronts of this in a different way. No bag lining today, unless you count like that underarm seam as having been bag lined. It's more just, again, the weird vest method mixed with whatever the heck I'm about to do next. There's no official name for how I'm doing this today, I don't think. I'm just pretending I know how to do tailoring, you know, as per usual. I'm gonna fake my way into it, hopefully. So yes, I have slip stitched that shut along the collar here, like so. That's all nice and smoothly finished. The outside of the shoulder seam, or the arm side, as it were, is finished here as well. Just slip stitched that shut. And now I need to deal with the center fronts of this, and then of course the hem along the bottom as well. So I'm going to fold this back that 1 3/4 of an inch that I had left myself as underlap, or sort of self-facing here. I'm leaving the lining free. I'm not dealing with the lining yet. I'm going to do that separately. I'm just folding the front edge of the outer fabric in on itself here, that full fold back that I had left myself. And then I'll just stitch this down by hand, and because I have this interlining in here, technically you could stitch it down just to the interlining if you wanted to, and if you did that, then there would be no stitches showing on the outside. It would be a little bit less structurally sound to do that, and because this fabric is so wild, there's no way you would see stitches on the outside, so I personally did stitch all the way through, even though I had this interlining in here. Just depends on what kind of finish you're looking for, what kind of fabrics you're using. If you have an interlining, though, you can definitely hem things in a much more invisible way. Something I learned from doing Victorian costuming over the years here. And then for the lining layer, I'm folding this in on itself an extra inch so that an inch of the brocade facing along the inside shows. Hopefully you'll see what I mean right here. So the lining is hemmed back an inch further so that an inch of the brocade shows along the front overlap. Again, see what I'm doing because it's hard to explain. But I'm hemming both front edges, the brocade and the lining, separately so that I can hem this lining down an inch back and have this extra little bit of brocade showing along the front overlap. Of course, if you wanted to do a button closure or do a hidden button closure like the actual McQueen coat has, you would want to finish this probably in a different way. But because I'm going to be finishing this with some hooks of a kind later, I don't have much else to worry about other than making this look nice and clean on the inside. You can see I'm using my hem gauge as I go along here just to make sure that 1 inch of brocade is showing along the inside overlap of this coat here. And I am leaving the last 4 or 5 inches here near the hems open, just because I will deal with that later once the hems of the coat are done as well. And then it's time to actually start thinking about my cape sleeves. And these I will bag line, except for the bottom hem. The bottom hem is going to be done separately in a different, slightly too time-consuming way, but I think it'll be best in the end for the extended life of this coat. But the long edge seams and the very top sort of sleeve cap of this, for lack of a better word, I will go ahead and just bag line this, sort of the more cone-shaped portion of this, while leaving the curved hem open. And once again, the last 4 or 5 inches of this I did leave free because I'm going to be hemming each layer independently for these and then tacking them together later, so I'll just leave myself a little bit of extra room down by the hem, even while doing this bag lining. As I'm recording this, it is actually strangely warm outside, but very windy. It's like 60 degrees here today, Fahrenheit, but very, very gusty out there. And I don't know if a cape coat would work. It'd be very billowy on a day like today. But it's actually relatively warm this week. Don't know what that's about. Probably will snow tomorrow. That's how it works in Colorado. The weather is extremely changeable in that way, where it can go from barbecue weather one day to snowed in the next. You just never really know. But I'll clip my curves and corners and turn this right side out. Again, you could do some edge stitching or top stitching for this kind of thing as well, if you were unsure about things staying in place. Just because of how I'm going to attach this down to the coat later, I'm not really worried about it, so I shan't worry about it. You can see again how the ends near the hem are open. I will fold back that center front inch-ish bit. I will put the coat vesty dress coat vest on the dress form here. The lazy, sad dress form. Again, you do not need a real dress form for something like this. You could put this on a pillow or a friend because I'm just here to drape the very top of this sleeve over the cap. You probably could do this flat and get away with it. I'm just using Donna, the dress form, the sad dress form from Joann's from 15 years ago because she's here, you know. I'm just going to pin this into place, again, lining up the center of my sleeve along that sleeve cap here where it overlaps a 1/2 inch, and then I will pin the finished edge of my capey sleeveness along the princess seam of the back of my coat dress here. And about midway down, I deviate and come out about 3/4 of an inch from that seam towards the arm, just because I wanted to give myself a tiny bit more room in this sleeve for some reason. I think it would have been fine if I followed the princess seam exactly as well, but you can see what it looks like in the end. I think it came out okay. You know, it's very questionable how I attached these cape sleeves onto this garment. I pinned the finished edge of the cape sleevey bits along the shoulder and along the back, and then I slip stitched the very, very edge of that down to the garment below, which was a more like a clean finish, but it was not very structurally secure. Like if my sleeve got caught on something, it would probably tear off. So I did go ahead and do another row of stitching just inside from there. And because again, this fabric was so textured, you could not see my stitches in it. I went ahead and did another line of stitching just inside the like finished edge where it had been sewn down to the garment. I did a line of back stitching just by hand through all the layers of the coat to really secure those sleeves down onto the garment itself. I stitched them into place as invisibly as I could from the outside, but I still needed that extra line of back stitching, really securing the cape bits down onto the undergarment. Now for the coat dress itself, I will go ahead and use some black taffeta bias that I had cut earlier for a different project to go ahead and finish the bottom edge of this. So this is actually some silk entering the mix here, some silk taffeta for the hem. And then I just actually pinned the lining in on itself almost a little bit loosely with a little bit of extra space and pinned it to the top of that bias tape along the inside here and then hemmed that into place by hand. This is so that I can remove that stitching later if I need to retrue this hem, because I don't trust over time either of these fabrics seem like they might stretch on the bias even further. Even though I let them hang for 2 days and retrued this hem before I did any of this, I still don't have full faith that they might not stretch over time in a different way. There are 3 different textiles going on here. We have the slightly loosely woven, like boucle lurex brocade. I have this very tightly woven, very slippery black polyester lining, and then I have the cotton muslin in there, which is kind of somewhere in between. So who knows if any of these are going to bubble out, stretch more than the other in the future, and keeping these hemmed almost separately like this means I can take the stitching out of this lining later and retrue the lining layer and stitch it back down if need be. And I did actually hem the cape sleevey bits similarly to how I hemmed the coat itself. So I hemmed the outer layer with silk taffeta bias tape, and I actually hemmed the lining with silk taffeta bias tape as well, and then I basted and tacked that down. So they are loosely stitched together along the hem, but once again, I wanted each to be hemmed separately, so if they stretch differently over time, I can retrue them as need be. And finally, for the front closure of this, I tried something a little bit different. I had these black, sort of almost like bra hooks in my stash, and I decided to use those on one side and loops of velvet ribbon on the other, just for a slightly looser closure along the center front of this, just because, again, this is going to be a coat that I want to throw over something else, so I didn't want anything too structured along the front of this, and I didn't want to have to bother with doing buttons and buttonholes in this brocade, so this worked out well for me in the end. here is my finished cape coat, feeling like some sort of a vampire and or Darth Vader, really giving that villainous vibe. As we all know, I'm really leaning into it here in my old age. So, you know, as the children would say, it's a vibe. And I am absolutely thrilled with how this coat came out. It's not practical. It's not made for scraping the snow off your car before you run to the grocery store. It's more of a like evening at the jazz club, wear to the theater, pop on if you're going to be walking around the antique store. Although, you know, the thing about this is I can't wear something like this out and about where there's going to be glassware because I will break it by turning too quickly and hitting it with my cape, so I do have to be more careful with things like this, but if you're more elegant, perhaps you can get away with this as day wear. But in any case, I hope you enjoyed seeing how this project came together today, and thank you as always for watching, and an extra special thanks to my patrons for making sharing this archive project with you possible. I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye!